What's going on, guys? JPS back for another video, and today we're going to be reacting to 5 ways British and American road trips are very different. This is another video from Lost in a Pond, so make sure you guys go show his channel some love. It's been quite some time since we've reacted to him. But before we get into this, I wanted to talk about my own experience with the British road trip and how I was like, wow, this is just not even close to an American road trip. So United States is enormous, right? I've taken some crazy road trips, like multiple day road trips in the United States where you're having to stop off, sleep in a hotel, and continue the road trip. Like, that can't really happen in the UK unless you're driving really slow. But I took a road trip this past summer from York to Scarborough, and at first I wasn't even considering that a road trip because, you know, they're like 40, 50 miles away, something like that. It's not that far. And it's like, despite it not being a far distance, the drive took so long because of all the roundabouts and all of the roads are just so compact. You know, they're not like a 5-lane highway. We're talking a 2-lane road to get from York to Scarborough. I believe it was the A64 or something like that. And the roads are just so small, and you have to be paying a lot more attention. I'm going to get into more in this video. I just wanted to introduce that because while I was on that trip from York to Scarborough, I was like, wow, this is, I thought it was just going to be, okay, we're hopping in the car, we're going to be there, boom. But it was like a journey. And I'm like, how is it a journey if we barely even traveled that far? Because the trip from York to Scarborough in the United States, that's like some people's everyday commute in terms of distance. So it's just mind-boggling. Anyways, let's get right into this.
Hello, my wife and I recently got back from a visit to West Virginia, and on that trip it got me thinking, how do road trips compare between my homeland of Britain and the United States? And with America being the land of car culture and Britain that of public transit, Americans might be thinking, is a British road trip even a thing? And yes, it is, but in my experience of doing road trips in both countries, it's a very different thing. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but one other journey that I've been on recently is the long march to 1 million subscribers. If you've done that, thank you. If you haven't, do that now.
Go
in the meantime, here are 5 ways that British and American road trips are very different. Now, you can't really compare and contrast road trips in the United States with road trips in Britain without talking about the distance involved. So when we drove from Chicago to West Virginia, it was something like 400 miles. And if you were to take that distance as a percentage of the distance from the East Coast to the West Coast, it's not that much. However, if you were to do the same thing in Britain, you would end up in the sea. The point is, everyone knows at this point, America, much larger than Britain. But what happens with that is that once you move to the United States, even having grown up in Britain, your perspective of distance changes. You see, it used to be that when I was a kid, we'd drive from Grimsby, my hometown, down to the southwest coast, and it took a few hours. We thought that was an eternity, because in British terms, that is. Remember, we're a country that's the size of Wyoming. But what struck me on this road trip recently is that I didn't really consider it that long at all. I mean, granted, I am now in my 40s, so my lower back felt it, but my brain didn't. You know, it was as if this was a normal thing to do. Of course, while I'm on the road, I get the peace of mind knowing that my name and address are far from the clutches of data brokers. You've probably heard me talk about them before.
All right, dude, you could have made that a little smoother.
The pond to get low.
No, but what he's saying about your perception of distance changing, it is so true. Like, 5 hours here, nothing, bro. You're just flying through the countryside or whatever it is, you know, even if it is interstates, it still just goes by so quickly because we're used to having to take long trips. Everything's far away from each other. But when I'm over in England, like I said, for this little road trip, I guess you could call it, that I took, like, it did feel long. 40-hour, like, I think it was like an hour car ride or something like that. That felt like a really long time because you're so used to everything being instant or being able to pop from one town to another in like 20 minutes. And it's crazy. And I can only imagine that those differences would be even more exaggerated if I had, you know, moved to England or spent more time there before going on that trip, because that's just from being there for a couple of weeks, really. So, dang, crazy.
Of course, there's one thing that I think probably helps Americans get used to the idea of driving a bit further than we might in Britain, and that's the size of our vehicles. I may have mentioned it before, but not only is the country much bigger than the United Kingdom, but so are the cars. Not for us, we have a Prius. But you will see on American roads plenty of either trucks, which is great for transporting stuff, or those minivans. Now, that's not to say that we don't have either of those two things in Britain. They're just not as widely embraced as they are here. I've experienced this. I've travelled again to West Virginia years ago in a minivan because we had multiple people coming with us. And honestly, it was hell now that I think about it, because there were too many people. We'd overestimated the space. But I could see a situation in where the minivan would be great. I'd have the whole 3 back seats to myself, and then everybody else has to squeeze together in front of me. Because that's just who I like my personal space. America gives me that. Just not in a Prius. In Britain, we're all about smaller vehicles. I think when I was a kid, we had a Fiat Uno, tiny hatchback, and I remember we drove fairly long distances in that. Of course, I was a child. I did silly things like, oh, lift my legs up onto the seat, or put them across my brother, or in my mum's face. And I was smaller, so it was easier. I mean, this is doing a disservice to our larger vehicles, but the point is, pound for pound, you don't have quite as much space in British cars. So it's a good job we don't drive as far.
Yeah, on the topic of that, I was in a Honda Fit, a subcompact car, so not the most spacious. And then come to the United States, everyone's got a Suburban, a big old lifted he's right about that. The space is a huge deal. On a road trip, you want to have a lot of space, especially if it's a long one. You don't want to be crammed up.
But another thing that helps put into perspective the long distances that we may or may not be travelling is how we pass the time. I've noticed that it is a common feature of road tripping in either country to play a game. It's just that the game in question may well differ. Take, for example, road trip bingo. Played in both countries, this is where passengers whip out a bingo card and check off the things they see. Whoever completes their card first wins. However, it's become clear that the items on a US bingo card don't always match those on a British one. And that's because the scenery and the things that occupy it differ somewhat on either side of the pond. For example, the UK's sheep population is around 7 times greater than that of the US, meaning it's literally impossible to have a road trip in the UK without seeing them a lot. Then again, unless you're driving through the 4 states that have banned it, the same thing might be true in the US when it comes to billboards. I became aware of a game growing up called Spotto, and this is where you basically look out for a yellow car and then the person who sees it says Spotto. But after I moved to the US and I was driving around with my wife, she brought to my attention something I'd never heard of called pediddle. And believe it or not, that's not something that you do at a rest stop. This is another game. You and others are on the lookout for a car whose headlight is out, and when you see that, you're supposed to say pediddle and hit the roof, apparently, in order to determine who it was who said it first. And another pastime specific to the US is the license plate game. This is where passengers observe traffic for the license plates of different states, the ultimate goal being to tally up plates from all 50 states. No equivalent for this exists in the UK, where rear license plates, regardless of region, are plain old yellow. Spotto. That said, we do have a different number plate game in which we might look out for number plates containing, say, a certain letter or number. But the biggest thing that I've noticed is that Americans are far more likely to break out into song. I thought this was a trope of the films because it happens in National Lampoon's Vacation and many others, until I got into a car with my wife's family. Take me home to the place. In Britain, I'm not saying we don't ever do that, but I think most of us are probably a bit self-conscious about the way we sing, and so that doesn't happen as often. And if it does, we'd have to be drunk, and if we're drunk, we shouldn't be using a motor vehicle. What I'm saying is we reserve the singing for weddings.
The singing is very much true in the country road song. I'm sure a lot of Americans sing that on road trips. But come on, bro, don't worry too much about how you sound when you sing. That's not what it's about. Come on, Brits, relax. Now, it's one thing that Google Maps will tell me, ooh, look, it's 9 hours to travel from here to there. But what that doesn't take into account is the fact that you're going to have to stop a lot, especially since we have a dog with us. So along the way, we got out at what Americans know as rest stops. And a lot of the time, rest stops in the United States are sort of small buildings that usually house some bathrooms, as well as pamphlets displaying places to go in the local area. Occasionally, of course, you do find those larger rest stops that have a full-on food court and things like that. They
exist as well. In Britain, there are one or two major differences when it comes to these outlets. Firstly, they're not called rest stops. They're known as motorway service areas. And these are usually the big kind of rest stops. You have your food courts, you have your toilets. You also have a lot more parking space. Partly that's going to be down to the fact that even though we're about the size of Wyoming, we have nearly twice the population of California. And this might also account for the fact that your parking spot within this car park is usually timed. But it's also down to the fact that ample space is afforded to trucks, often known as lorries in Britain. It should be noted that the US concept of truck stops, in other words stops used exclusively by trucks, are not nearly as common in the UK. The other thing to note here is that at British rest stops there's usually a hotel attached to it in case you need to stay there overnight. You don't typically find this at American rest stops because most towns or cities have a complex of hotels somewhere in its vicinity.
Bro, literally every town or city in the United States is gonna have Holiday Inn, Courtyard by Marriott, what, you know, it's all the same. Well, I don't know about that, but same thing, kind of.
Britain also has hotels, the likes of Travelodge and Premier Inn. And I'm not going to spend this time boring you with the differences between British and American hotels because I did that in a previous video. But what I am going to say is that there's a cheaper alternative in the United States that a lot of road trippers capitalize on, and that alternative is motels. Motels did originate in the United States as a portmanteau of motor hotels, and they are bog standard, about the term I would use for every motel that I've ever stayed in. There's no swimming pool, there's no jacuzzi or hot.
There's drug dealers and prostitutes. Not at every motel, but like a good deal of them. That's where those types of people hang around. So yeah, they're cheap though. Motels are they can be really cheap, but you get what you pay for. You want some bed bugs, you want a paper thin wall, you want a bathroom that's not clean, you can pay 30 quid. It's yours for the night. Won't be fun though.
There's no jacuzzi or hot tub or anything like that. It's basically just a room, and then you've got the manager's office. It's like in Psycho. We've all seen the Bates Motel. Most motels feel like that. I've never been murdered, as proven by the fact that I'm still doing this video, but I have felt like there's somebody in the room with me, and it's usually my wife, and everything's fine. From the British side of things, I have two things to say here. Firstly, because we don't travel such great distances, there might be an argument that we don't really need to stop off anywhere en route to where we're actually ending up. So a lot of the time we don't end up making that sort of overnight stay in the middle of our journey. But if we were to do it, in my experience, we used to just check into one of those Premier Inn hotels or a travel lodge. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that's normal among all Brits who travel, or if it's just another indication that my family is really middle class. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you've been on a road trip in Britain and America and what your observations were. In the meantime, I'm going to go and read about what to do in West Virginia, even though I am now home. While I'm doing that, here's a video I did back in the day about the hotel differences between Britain and America.
That was a really good video. I honestly, like that, this was a thought I was having while I was on that road trip, that I keep calling a road trip. The trip from York to Scarborough though, because that, you know, I'm visiting, so most of the time I'm taking trains, but I was with Wild One Radio, so I actually got to ride in the car and go on the road trip, which is, it's a huge difference between traveling by car and by train in the UK. I really should make a video on that. It's a big difference. So a huge difference in the United States as well, but like once you're actually in that car and you're on those little roads, I'm like, what is this? This is not the type of road trip that I'm used to. It was completely different. So really enjoyed this. Again, make sure you guys go show some love to Lost in the Pond. This guy always has great videos, and I appreciate you all watching. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.